Let me tell you about a morning in March of 1984, out in western Oklahoma, where a man got laughed at so hard in front of 100 people that the story still gets told at feed stores 42 years later, but not the way you'd think. Not the way any of them laughing that morning would have guessed. Picture this with me. It's the second Saturday of March, and the sun is just coming up over the plains outside Cordell, Oklahoma. The ground is still hard from an overnight frost, and there's a thin crust of white on the cattle guards. Red dust, the kind that only comes off plowed Oklahoma soil, is already drifting in the wind, the way it's drifted there for 100 years. The Kiowa County Equipment Auction Lot sits off a 2-lane highway, a gravel rectangle about the size of 2 football fields, rutted from the rain that came through the night before. Diesel engines are idling. Men are standing around with paper cups of coffee going cold in their hands. Breath showing white, chewing tobacco and spitting into the gravel. The whole place smells like motor oil, like stale coffee, like wet dust and axle grease. The ranchers are there in their starched Wranglers and their good boots. The bankers from town came out in press shirts, trying to look like they belong, and the implement dealers drove down from Oklahoma City in their shiny crew cab trucks, moving between the rows of machinery like men at a livestock show, running their hands over tractors and planters and grain drills, writing numbers in little notebooks. And into that gravel lot, right around 7:30 in the morning, rattles a 1961 Chevy Apache pickup truck. Now I need you to see this truck, because this truck is the whole story. It had been Harvest Gold once, back when it rolled off the lot new in Elk City in 1961. 23 years later, the paint had oxidized to the color of old straw left out in the sun. One front fender had been replaced sometime in the 1970s after a run-in with a fence post, and the replacement fender was still in primer gray because the man driving the truck had never seen the point of painting it to match. The tailgate was bent. You could see the dent right in the middle where something heavy had come down on it years back, and it was held shut with a length of log chain wrapped twice and clipped with a padlock. There was a hole rusted clean through the bed, maybe the size of a dinner plate, and covered over with a square of roofing tin. The passenger window wouldn't roll up the last 2 inches, so a folded feed sack was stuffed in the gap to keep the wind out. The man driving it was named Jeremiah Halstead. Everybody called him Jer. He was 38 years old. He'd driven that pickup 34 miles that morning from his 110 acres outside Cordell to come bid on a used John Deere 4020 tractor that was part of a neighbor's estate sale. Here's what you need to understand about Jer. His father had been killed in a combine accident when Jer was 7 years old. His mother never quite came back from it, and he was raised mostly by his grandmother, a woman named Ruth Halstead, who had held on to that same 110 acres all the way through the Dust Bowl, when half the county blew away and the other half walked off to California. Ruth had one line she said to Jer about 200 times before she died. "A man who owes nothing owns his own sunrise. A man who borrows owns somebody else's worry." Jer took over the farm in 1973, the year Ruth passed, and for 11 straight years he had lived by that line while every other farmer in the county leveraged himself to the eyes trying to get bigger. That truck he drove in that morning, his grandfather had bought it new in Elk City in 1961. Jer had been a 10-year-old boy standing in that showroom. He had nursed it for 23 years and 340,000 miles. Every dollar he hadn't spent on chrome, he still had. That was the point. Now, into this gravel lot, about 10 minutes after Jer parked, rolls a brand new 1984 Chevy Silverado dually. 2-tone black and silver paint, chrome running boards, CB antenna whipping off the back, tan leather interior you could see right through the windshield. The kind of truck that made men look twice. Behind the wheel was Royce Tanner. Royce was the biggest operator in Kiowa County. 3,100 acres of wheat and cattle ground. 52 years old, loud, well-liked, or at least well-known, which in a small county is almost the same thing. And here is a thing nobody standing in that lot knew yet. A thing I'll come back to. Royce Tanner was, at that very moment, quietly hemorrhaging money. He'd taken out 2 loan extensions already. There was a second mortgage on his home place, but none of that was visible. What was visible was the Silverado. Royce climbed down out of that truck, and the first thing he saw was Jer's Apache. He stopped, he grinned, and then he called out, loud, the way he always did, "Boys, boys, come look at this." Half the lot wandered over. Royce walked a slow circle around the Apache like he was appraising it. He lifted the log chain on the tailgate and let it clank back down. He thumped the roofing tin on the rusted bed with the toe of his boot, and the tin went bongo bongo. He peered in at the feed sack stuffed in the window, and then, with an audience of maybe 40 men around him, he turned on Jer. "Jer, son, what did you do? Push this thing in from Cordell." The crowd laughed. "That ain't a truck. That's a lawsuit on wheels." More laughter. "Tell me you ain't fixing to haul a 4020 tractor home in this. The floorboard'll give out before you clear the highway." They were howling now. Grown men, bent over. Royce caught his breath and went in for the kill. "Go on home, Halstead. Come back when you can afford a real truck." Jer was standing by the driver's door of the Apache the whole time. He didn't flinch. He didn't color up. He didn't clench a fist. He waited until Royce was done, and then he looked him in the eye and said, quiet and even, "You're right about the truck, Mr. Tanner. She's seen better days." And then he did the thing that made the whole story. He turned around, walked past the laughing men, walked over to the folding chairs set up under the auction tent, and sat down in the middle row, crossed his legs, folded open the auction catalog on his knee. The crowd kept laughing for maybe another 5 or 6 seconds. And then, one by one, the laughter started to trail off because they were figuring out that he wasn't leaving. He was staying for the auction. Now here's what you need to understand. When a man gets humiliated in public, there's usually 2 roads out. He breaks, or he lights up. He goes quiet and small, or he gets loud and reckless. Jer Halstead did neither one. He just sat down in that folding chair with his catalog, and in the margins of that catalog there were numbers written in pencil. Numbers that nobody in that lot had any idea about. Because this story isn't about a beat-up truck, and it isn't about a cruel man in a new Silverado. It's about what a quiet man does with an auction catalog, a grandmother's voice in his head, and 23 years of every single dollar he refused to spend on chrome. And that's the part I want to tell you about next. Now, the auction itself didn't start right away. These things never do. The auctioneer was a wiry little man out of Weatherford named Lyle Boggs, red-faced, hoarse before he'd even gotten warmed up, with a cordless microphone clipped to a bolo tie and a grease-stained cowboy hat pushed back on his head. Lyle started, the way they always start, with the small lots. A pallet of barbed wire, a box of hand tools, a busted-up grain drill with 2 missing discs, small bids, small crowd noise, men standing around with their hands in their pockets waiting for the real items to come up. The whole time, Royce Tanner was parked in the front row with 2 of his foremen flanking him like a couple of bodyguards. He was tipped back in his folding chair, hat cocked, tipping it to every man who walked by, shaking hands, cutting up. Everybody could see Royce. That was the point. Royce had come that morning to buy 2 things, the John Deere 4020 tractor and the 16-row planter that matched it. Those were the centerpieces of the sale. Everybody in the county knew it. 4 rows back in the middle of the tent sat Jer Halstead. The keys to the Apache were in his shirt pocket. The auction catalog was open on his knee, and in the margins, in soft pencil, were numbers only he understood. Here's what I want you to sit with for a minute. Here's the thing the whole crowd was getting wrong. They looked at that beat-up Apache out in the lot, and they did the math the way most people do math. They said, a man who can't afford a new truck can't afford anything. A man driving a 23-year-old pickup with a chain on the tailgate is a man who's broke. And so they already knew, before the bidding even started, where Jer Halstead fit in the pecking order that morning, down at the bottom. But they had it exactly backwards. That truck wasn't evidence of poverty. That truck was evidence of 11 straight years of refusing to spend a single dollar he didn't have. Every payment he hadn't made on a new pickup. Every dollar he hadn't put down on chrome running boards or a leather interior or a factory radio. Every finance charge he'd never paid to a bank. All of it had gone somewhere. The crowd was reading the surface of the man. Jer was holding the total. Around 11:30 in the morning, right before they were going to break for lunch, Lyle Boggs cleared his throat into the microphone and said, "All right, boys, let's bring up the 4020. The crowd tightened up. You could feel it. Men who'd been leaning on trucks came walking over. The auction tent filled up. Lyle opened the bidding at $3,500. Royce Tanner's number card went up before Lyle had finished the sentence. An implement dealer from Clinton countered him. They traded up the ladder, the way 2 serious buyers do. 4,000, 4,500, 5,000. The crowd was watching Royce, grinning, enjoying the show. At 5,500, the Clinton dealer set his card down on his knee and shook his head. Out. Lyle swung the microphone. 5,500. Going once. And from 4 rows back, Jer Halstead raised his hand. 5,750. Heads turned. Somebody in the back of the tent actually laughed. A short, surprised bark, because he thought it was a joke. Royce Tanner twisted around in his chair, saw Jer sitting there with his catalog on his knee, and a slow grin came across his face, like he'd just been handed a second show for the morning. 6,000, Royce called out, loud, making a point of it. 6,250, Jer said. Same voice as before, calm, even. 6,500. 7. 72. 75. And right there, Royce hesitated for the first time. I want you to see that moment, because that moment was the first crack. Royce glanced sideways at his foreman. He looked over at the tractor. He looked back at Jer. The grin was still on his face, but it wasn't the same grin anymore. 8,000, Royce said, and it came out harder than he meant. Too hard. Too loud. 8,250, Jer said. Same voice. Same flat, quiet tone he'd used to say, "You're right about the truck, Mr. Tanner." Royce looked down at his number card. He looked at his foreman, and then he gave the smallest shake of his head. Jaw set. Done. Lyle banged the gavel. Sold. To the gentleman in the middle row, in the Apache. Now here's where the story gets good, because the auctioneer didn't stop for lunch. The 16-row planter came up next. Same pattern. Royce opened. A dealer countered. Jer came in 4 rows back. Royce tried to hold, tried to push, and Jer took it at $6,400. Then Lyle brought up a flatbed trailer. Jer took it. Then a set of grain augers. Jer took those too. Every single time one of the dealers or Royce himself tried to push a lot higher, Jer would answer one tick up and then just hold. Quiet, unmoving. And one by one, they'd fold. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Jeremiah Halstead, the man in the straw-colored pickup with the chain tailgate, had bought 4 of the 6 major lots of the entire sale. And he paid for every one of them in full. Cashier's check, drawn on the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Cordell. A bank he had never in his life borrowed a single dollar from. A bank he had only, for 11 years, put money into. When he walked up to the clerk's table to settle, the gravel lot had gone so quiet you could hear boots shifting on the rocks. Men were watching him the way you watch a card trick you don't understand yet. Royce Tanner was standing off to the side of the tent with his arms crossed tight over his chest, and his face had gone the color of Oklahoma dust at sundown. That deep, angry red. Jer signed the papers, counted out the cashier's checks, arranged with a hauler standing by to run the tractor and the planter out to his place. And then he folded the receipts into his shirt pocket, the same pocket the keys were in, and turned to walk back out to the Apache. He had to pass Royce to do it. Royce waited until he was close, and then, low, rough, just for Jer to hear, "Where the hell do a man like you get that kind of money?" Jerry stopped. He looked at Royce, not angry, not smug, just looked at him, the way a man looks at another man he's known for 20 years. And he said, "Same place anybody gets it, Mr. Tanner. I just didn't spend it." He nodded out toward the Apache sitting in the gravel. "That truck's been my bank for 23 years. Every time I didn't trade her in, I put the payment in a can." And he walked out. He climbed into that rattling old Chevy, turned the key, let the engine cough and settle, pulled out of the gravel lot onto the 2-lane highway, and drove the 34 miles back to Cordell with the muffler singing the whole way home. And the last picture I want to leave you with, before I tell you the next part, is this one. Royce Tanner, standing in the dust of that auction lot, right next to his brand new 2-tone Silverado with the chrome running boards and the leather interior, finally understanding, for the very first time in his life, what that old straw-colored pickup had actually meant. But to understand how a man shows up to an auction in a chain tailgate pickup and walks out owning half the sale, for that, we need to go back 11 years, to the morning after his grandmother's funeral. And that's the part I want to tell you next. To understand what happened that morning in the auction lot, to really understand it, we need to go back 11 years, to 1973, to the morning after Ruth Halstead's funeral. Picture a small farmhouse outside Cordell, 4 rooms, white clapboard siding that needed painting, a barn out back with a roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt, 110 acres of Oklahoma dirt, some of it planted in winter wheat, some of it pasture for 18 head of cattle, some of it just prairie the way God made it. Jer Halstead was 27 years old. He was sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The house was dead quiet the way a house gets when somebody has just left it for the last time. Now here's what Ruth had left him. She'd left him the 110 acres. She'd left him the 4-room house. She'd left him the barn. And she'd left him the Apache, already 12 years old that morning and running fine. But the thing she'd really left him was the line she'd said to him about 200 times. A man who owes nothing owns his own sunrise. A man who borrows owns somebody else's worry. That morning, sitting at her kitchen table, Jer made a promise. He made it out loud, to nobody, the way a man makes a promise when he's the only one left to hear it. No debt, ever. Small and diverse, always. The long game, never the short one. And then he went to work. Let me walk you through what the next 11 years looked like. Not as a list, as a life. The winter of 1975, the roof over the kitchen started leaking. A contractor out of Elk City quoted him $800 to put a new roof on. Jer thanked the man, drove him back to the highway, and then spent the next 3 weekends up on a ladder with salvaged tin and a bucket of roofing nails patching it himself. It took him a month. It cost him $42 in materials. When he climbed down off that ladder the last time, the can under the floorboard was $758 heavier than it would have been. The spring of 1977, every farmer in Kiowa County was walking into the production credit office in town and walking out with loans. Land was going up. Grain prices were good. The Soviets were buying American wheat like it was going out of style. And the word from Washington, from the Secretary of Agriculture himself, was get big or get out. Expand. Leverage. Buy the neighbor's place when he goes under. That was the gospel. Jer walked into that production credit office on a Tuesday morning in April. He sat down across from a loan officer. He listened, and then he stood up, shook the man's hand, and walked out without signing a single piece of paper. He drove home in the Apache. He never set foot in that office again. The summer of 1979, the transmission in the Apache started slipping. A mechanic in Cordell told him it'd be $450 to rebuild it. Jer drove home, went into the house, pulled down a Chilton repair manual from a shelf in the back bedroom, and read it for 3 nights straight at the kitchen table. Then he pulled the transmission himself on the dirt floor of the barn over a long weekend in July, rebuilt it on a workbench with a set of sockets his grandfather had owned, and bolted it back in on a Sunday evening. It cost him $86 in parts. He drove the Apache into town the next morning, and she shifted like she was new. The fall of 1981, beef prices collapsed. The cattle market fell out from under every rancher in western Oklahoma. Men who had borrowed to build their herds were running to the banks begging for extensions. Jer had 18 head of Herefords. He owned every one of them outright. He didn't owe a dime on the barn or the fences or the feed. So he did what most of his neighbors couldn't do. Nothing. He kept his 18 head. He fed them out. He waited. And when prices came back, he sold. Now I need to tell you about the coffee can. In the storm cellar behind the house, dug into the red clay under a loose board in the floor, Jer kept a Folgers coffee can, a big red plastic one. It sat behind the rows of canned green beans and stewed tomatoes his grandmother had put up in the last summer of her life. Jars he never quite had the heart to eat, because once they were gone, they were gone. Every spare dollar went in that can. Egg money from the laying hens. Broiler money when he sold a batch of fryers to a neighbor. Calf money in the fall. $2 here, $40 there, sometimes $100. Small, steady. Patient. The kind of saving that nobody writes a magazine article about because it isn't exciting enough to sell anything. By the time his neighbor died in the early winter of 1984 and the estate went to auction, that can held a number. A number I'm not going to tell you, because the number doesn't matter. What matters is this. It was enough. It was more than enough. Now I need to pull the camera back for a minute, because you can't understand this story without understanding what was happening to everybody else. In the late 1970s, American farming had gone through a boom. Interest rates were cheap, 7%, 8%. The Soviets were buying grain. Land values were climbing every year. And the government was telling every farmer in America to leverage up and expand. Get big or get out. Farmers borrowed. They bought new combines. They bought their neighbors' places. They signed for $500,000, $1 million, $2 million in debt against land that kept going up and up and up. And then in 1979, a man named Paul Volcker took over the Federal Reserve. And to kill off inflation, Volcker put interest rates through the ceiling. By 1981, they were above 20%. And every farmer who had borrowed at 7% had to refinance at 20%. Land values collapsed. The ground that had been worth $2,000 an acre was suddenly worth $800, and every man who owed on it still owed the full amount. By 1983, the farm crisis was rolling across the plains like a storm. Foreclosures, auctions, suicides. There were suicides, I won't pretend there weren't. Families who had worked the same ground for 3 generations were watching the sheriff nail a notice to their front door. That was the gravity the whole story was happening inside. And here's the part I haven't told you yet. Here's the part that explains the new Silverado and the loud voice and the chrome running boards. Royce Tanner was in the middle of it. By the middle of 1983, 8 months before he stood in the auction lot and laughed at the Apache, Royce Tanner had already taken 2 loan extensions from his bank. There was a second mortgage on the home place his grandfather had homesteaded. There was a combine he was hiding in a neighbor's shed because the repo agent out of Oklahoma City had been nosing around. There was an unpaid fuel bill at the Cordell Co-op that he kept promising to settle at the end of the month. And the Silverado, the brand new 2-tone Silverado with the leather interior. He had bought that truck on credit, specifically so that nobody in Kiowa County would guess. The chrome was camouflage. The shouting at the auction was camouflage. The big laugh and the loud voice and the comeback when you can afford a real truck. All of it, camouflage. Royce Tanner was a drowning man performing solvency for a county that would have eaten him alive if they'd suspected. And that's what Jer Halstead had been living next to for 11 years. 2 kinds of poverty. The kind you can see, a straw-colored pickup with a chain on the tailgate. And the kind you can't, a man in a new truck with a second mortgage and a combine hidden in somebody else's shed. The whole county had spent 11 years looking at the wrong one. And that brings us finally to what Jer did with the tractor and the planter and the flatbed trailer after he drove them home from the auction. Because the good stories don't end at the big moment. What a man does in the quiet years afterward. That's what tells you who he really was. And that's the part I want to tell you last. Now here's the thing about a story like this. The big moment. The auction, the bidding, the cashier's checks, the drive home with the muffler singing. That's the part people remember. That's the part that gets told at feed stores and around kitchen tables. But the good stories don't end at the big moment. What a man does in the quiet years after a public victory. That's what tells you who he really was. So let me tell you about the years that came after. Over the next 18 months, as the farm crisis tightened around Kiowa County like a fist, Jer Halstead did something that nobody expected. He started renting out the John Deere 4020 and the 16-row planter to his neighbors at cost. No interest, no collateral, no paperwork. He asked one thing, and one thing only, that the equipment come back full of fuel with the tires aired up. Families who would have lost their spring planting that year got crops in the ground because a man who'd been laughed at in a gravel lot didn't see any reason to charge them for it. In the summer of 1986, the Federal Land Bank foreclosed on a 480-acre section 2 miles east of Jer's place. A family he'd known since he was a boy, the Kellerman family, 3 generations on that ground. Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, all buried in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church. The bank scheduled the liquidation sale for a Tuesday morning in July. Jer sat at his kitchen table the night before the sale with a yellow legal pad. He did the math on the coffee can, the cattle, and 3 good wheat years. He drove out to the liquidation sale the next morning in the Apache. He bid on the 480 acres, and he bought it outright. That afternoon, he drove over to the single-wide trailer where the Kellerman family had moved after the foreclosure. He knocked on the door. The eldest son, a man named Dean Kellerman, 31 years old, with 3 kids and a wife and no idea what he was going to do come fall, answered the door. Jer stood on the steps of that trailer and said, "Dean, I bought your ground this morning. I'd like to sell it back to you. 4% over 20 years. Contract for deed. 1 page of paper. Handshake." Dean Kellerman sat down on the steps of that trailer and he cried. Grown man, 31 years old, just sat down and cried. By the end of 1988, working that same way, quietly, 1 family at a time, no bank involved, no paperwork beyond a single typed page, Jer had helped 9 families in Kiowa County keep or recover their ground. Now let me tell you about Royce Tanner. In the fall of 1985, 18 months after the morning he stood in the auction lot and laughed at the Apache, the bank finally called Royce's notes, all of them, at once. Royce stood on the courthouse steps in Hobart on a Thursday morning in October and watched 2,700 of his 3,100 acres go under the hammer to a corporate buyer out of Dallas. He was 54 years old. The Silverado was repossessed the same week. He moved into a rented single-wide trailer on his cousin's land outside Lone Wolf and took a job driving a hay truck for a custom cutter for $6 an hour. And then, sometime in the spring of 1987, Jer Halstead walked into the Cordell feed store on a Saturday morning and saw Royce Tanner standing at the counter. Royce was buying one 50-pound bag of layer pellets. He was counting out a folded $5 bill and some change onto the counter. He was a different man, thinner, shoulders down, didn't look anybody in the eye. Jer waited until Royce had paid. He walked out to the parking lot with him, and this is what he said. "Royce, I've got 60 acres on the home place I'm not working this year. I'd like to lease it to you on shares. You farm it. I'll pay for the seed and the diesel. We split what comes off it 50-50. If it's a bad year, we both eat. If it's a good year, we both win." Royce Tanner stood in the parking lot of that feed store with a 50-pound bag of layer pellets on his shoulder, and he couldn't quite look at Jer. He looked at the ground. He looked at the Apache. He looked at his own hands, and he said, "Jer, why in God's name would you do that for me?" And Jerry said, "Because a man needs a crop in the ground, that's all." They shook on it right there in the parking lot, beside the rattling Apache. Royce farmed those 60 acres for 11 years, until arthritis took his hands in 1998. And in all that time, whenever Jer asked him to, Royce would show up at the FFA meeting at the Cordell High School. Those future farmers of America boys, 17 years old, all of them thinking they were going to be the next big operator in the county. Royce would stand up in front of those boys and he would tell them the truth, the whole truth, about the first loan in 1974, and the second one in 76, and the third one in 78, about the combine he hid in a neighbor's shed, about the unpaid fuel bill at the co-op, about the brand new Silverado he bought specifically to hide the second mortgage on his home place, and about the morning in the auction lot in March of 1984, when he stood in front of 100 men and laughed at a man in a beat-up Chevy pickup, and didn't understand, not until it was too late, that the truck was the whole lesson. He ended every single one of those talks the same way. He'd look out at those 17-year-old boys and he'd say, "Don't thank me, I'm the warning. Thank Jer Halstead. He's the proof." Royce Tanner died on a Sunday morning in the spring of 2003, 72 years old, stroke, in the single-wide trailer outside Lone Wolf. They buried him at the Little Baptist Church on State Highway 54, and Jer Halstead was one of 6 pallbearers at that funeral. After the service, a young reporter from the Lawton paper, a woman, maybe 25 years old, came up to Jer at the graveside and asked him a question. She said, "Mr. Halstead, I'm told Royce Tanner humiliated you in front of 100 people in 1984. Why would you carry his casket?" Jer looked off past the cemetery fence toward the wheat stubble stretching flat to the horizon. The wind was moving through it the way it always moves through Oklahoma wheat. And he answered her in his own words for the first and only time. He said, "The people who laugh at you don't matter. They never did. What matters is what you do next, whether you get back up and whether you stay up." And he said, Royce spent the last 16 years of his life telling the truth to young men who needed to hear it. That's a good ending for a man, and helping him get there is the only kind of revenge worth the name. That reporter printed his words in the Lawton paper the following Sunday. Now let me tell you where things stand today. Jer Halstead is 80 years old. He still lives on the same 110 acres his grandmother Ruth held through the Dust Bowl. Same 4-room farmhouse, same porch. His knees won't let him throw hay bales anymore, so he leases most of the ground to 2 young families who farm it his way. Small, diverse, no debt, patient, and he still drives the Apache. She's 65 years old now. The tailgate still chains shut. The paint is still that oxidized straw color. The hole in the bed is still covered with a square of roofing tin, though it's a different square now. The old one finally rusted through in 2011. The engine has been rebuilt 3 more times since 1984, and the last rebuild was done by a neighbor's son, a man named Caleb Marsh, whose father was one of the 9 families Jer helped keep their ground in the 80s. And every second Saturday of March, for 42 years running now, Jer Halstead drives that Apache 34 miles up the 2-lane highway to the Kiowa County Equipment Auction Lot. Most years it's a different sale, different auctioneer, different faces, different machinery, but the gravel lot is the same, and the prairie wind is the same, and the red dust still drifts off the plowed sections exactly the way it did in 1984. He doesn't buy anything. He doesn't sell anything. He parks the Apache at the edge of the lot, where anybody walking in can see her. He walks over to the folding chairs under the auction tent. He sits in the middle row for about an hour. He listens to the bidding, and before he leaves, he walks back across the gravel to that old straw-colored pickup, and he puts one hand flat on the faded hood for a moment, just for himself. Then he climbs in, turns the key, lets the engine cough and settle, and drives the 34 miles home.